Okay. Oh, beautiful. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues, and overseas visitors, and Melburnians who have not possibly slept very well through the warmest April night in more than 20 years. My name is Anne Capling. I'm Acting Director of the Centre for Public Policy, and I'm really here to welcome you to the conference on behalf of the University of Melbourne. I do hope that you, those of you who aren't from the area, do get a chance in this balmy weather to have a bit of a wander around the campus. It's a very small campus, and it's a very pretty campus. So do have a wander in one of your spare moments. I notice, though, the conference program is very packed, and there aren't many of those. There's a number of preliminaries to get through this morning, so I'll be very brief. I just really want to thank a few organizations and people. Putting on a conference like this by a department with a limited budget is at no mean feat, and in fact it would have been very mean had it not been for the very generous support of a number of sponsors. That includes all 3 levels of government, local, state, and Commonwealth, as well as the U.S. government, who has also provided assistance, and we thank them very much. Our government sponsors include Multimedia Victoria, who have representatives here today, the Australian Government Information Office from the Commonwealth, and as I mentioned, the U.S. government. We also have support from a number of NGOs and businesses, including Cisco Systems Australia, App Streaming Media Network, and we must offer our particular thanks to them for making the event so much more accessible by webcasting the entire event live and worldwide. And finally, to the Victorian Local Governance Association, which has been very, very active in the area of e-governance. I just wanted also to acknowledge especially John Peacock and Tian Luong, who I assume are up there in the control booth, of the University of Melbourne's Teaching Spaces Services, who are also working with AppStream to make the webcast happen. And last but not least, organizing conferences is a thankless task, and I'm sure some of you will have been involved in such activities in the past. And I really want to thank especially the academics from the Department of Political Science and the Centre of Public Policy, who have devoted a lot of time outside of their usual research, teaching and administration to make this event possible this week. That includes the principal organizer of the conference, Peter Chen, who I'm sure you will all meet before the 2 days are over, as well as my colleagues and Peter's colleagues, Michael Crozier, Winsome Roberts, Joe Barakat, and Milsom Henry Waring. So we thank you all, and I'll leave it to Michael.
Thank you, Anne. I'm Michael Crozier from the Department of Political Science here at the Uni of Melbourne. I'm not going to talk, I'm merely sort of the baton bearer here. But before I do proceed, and I'd like to just say, mention a couple of people's names on behalf of the organising committee, who, as Anne said, have been of invaluable help. They include Darren Smith, Wendy Ruffles, Lauren Rosewarne, Joan Babunis, Matthew Belgium and Claire Ellis. I'd like now to hand over to Mr. Randall Straw from the Victorian Government, who will officially open the conference. Randall is the Executive Director of Multimedia Victoria, the organisation responsible for the implementation of the Victorian Government's policy on information and communication technologies, entitled Connecting Victoria. So without sort of too further ado, over to you, Randall.
You never get out of this without a word from your sponsor. Welcome to international and interstate guests to Melbourne. I hope you found it an enjoyable experience so far. Can I first apologise to my Minister, Minister Marcia Thompson, the Minister for ICT, who's unavailable today and couldn't make it here, so you actually get a bureaucrat instead. But it's great pleasure that I'm here today, because this is something that I passionately believe in regards to the impact of ICT on economies and societies. And I think it's great that the University of Melbourne's actually convened such a conference to actually have some active discussion on this. Connecting Victoria, which is the state's ICT policy, was developed in 1999, and it outlined and tried to set an agenda that had a balance between a social, educational and economic agenda for universal adoption and access to ICT. It has certainly grown and morphed since then, but it continues to be premised on 3 bases. One is networked ICT, things like e-business, will continue to change how people and businesses interact. Networked ICT, like the internet and mobile connectivity, will continue to change how people and communities interact, which together means that ICT changes how societies and economies operate. What I'd like to do this morning very quickly, before I pass over to your main speaker, is to just give you some of the rationale behind the Connecting Victoria policy, and in particular behind the role ICT has in connecting communities and societies. I'd like to share some of this thinking with you, and some of also what we see in government as some of the emerging ICT policy issues, and what we see as potentially new digital divides emerging. Why does government have a role in this space? Well, in 1999, when Connecting Victoria was developed, our concern was some people would be left behind in the information economy. We saw the information economy as a fundamental change with characteristics similar to other network change in history, such as the arrival of trains, roads, electricity and telephony. And the characteristics of such changes, as we saw it, were that the changes become rapidly all-pervasive and commoditised as costs fall. Innovation explodes by networked change. The full ramifications of these changes are always underestimated if you look at history. The changes bring significant benefits to business and citizens. However, history has also shown that private investment alone is less than perfect from a society's perspective at correcting the impacts of new change, and government has a role in facilitating adjustment and mitigating negative social and economic impacts. So what were our policy goals around digital divide aspects? There were three main policy goals. First, there was building what we've called network strength. Our primary focus there was providing access to computer terminals and the internet for people. Our public internet access program was good for its day and is probably still good today. It provided free or affordable internet access in public places throughout the state, including rural and regional Victoria. The thinking at the time was publicly available computer terminals should be freely available and as ubiquitous at that time as public telephony. We principally used libraries and schools infrastructure to achieve what we have today. Today, the number of locations with government-funded public access terminals is comparable or higher per capita in Victoria than other jurisdictions. Across Victoria, there is an average of 3,000 people per government-funded location across Victoria. By comparison, Canada Online supports about 3,200, and the UK Online program supports one centre per 8,500 UK citizens outside the Greater London area. Our second policy goal was about growing skills and knowledge. By providing access to hardware wasn't enough. Without the skills, training and encouragement to use the technology, many people were still missing out on the benefits of the technology revolution. And yet everyone in the community had the right and the emerging need to be computer literate. We needed to help people obtain the skills they needed to participate fully in the information economy, both as a consumer but also as potential producers as well. In particular, low-income earners, unemployed Victorians, people with disabilities, older Victorians and people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities were at risk of being excluded totally from this revolution. We developed some highly original and innovative programs, including a program called SkillsNet, which provided free and affordable access and training to those Victorians who wouldn't otherwise have it. The program has been a wonderful success over the years, with more than 100,000 people signing up to the program and more than 80% of our SkillsNet centres being in regional Victoria. Many people have benefited from the SkillsNet program, have never touched a computer before, and many lack the confidence to try. And our third policy goal was about strengthening communities. If we define a strong community as one where you have many people or groups to turn to for help and assistance, then over time our communities have been consistently eroded. And this is especially true in Victorian rural communities. We've all heard the cry of country towns that not just their economy, but their community is weakened by things like bank closures. Their young people drift to the cities, their local football club closes, not just because it's losing players, but because their coach was the local bank manager, and he's gone too. One of the yardsticks of social cohesion is the connectedness felt by individual members of the community. Our view was online facilities could help that. Not a silver bullet, but could help that. It could provide community groups with a range of ways to improve their viability in three ways. First, it could provide community groups with new tools to do things that they currently do better. Things like disseminate information, promote themselves and their services, recruit new members, advocate, network and raise funds. Secondly, it could allow these groups to build links with other groups of similar interests or common objectives. And finally, public access spaces, those civic spaces, can help create community by bringing people together in a civic place to utilise public internet access. One of our programs, My Connected Community, took the skills and training developed through SkillsNet and then went further by providing community groups with the support and tools needed to build online communities. These communities range from stamp collectors to emergency workers to nursing mothers to trail bike riders. What is interesting now is how commercial models are now being formed around this space. An example is Meetup.com, set up by Scott Hefferman in the US, but the idea you could use the net to build community links by arranging physical meetups for communities. Now that has morphed again, because it seems people now want a stronger sense of belonging to something bigger, that they're local groups and are creating large chapters or organisations out of this. So what's next? Hopefully some of those things about what next you'll take into account over the next few days. So if the first digital divide was about those between those who had a computer and the internet and those that didn't, we would call that the basic adoption stage of ICT in Victoria. We think the coming digital divide may be the difference between those who have full access to a range of new online services and those who don't. Whilst addressing unequal access to the next generation of online services, it doesn't mean the old digital divide has been solved. But the new online services will take on increasing significance in daily life, and people lacking full access to them will be increasingly disadvantaged. And I see a few concerning trends coming as well, which presents challenges for organisations like governments. One is broadband applications. More and more online services will require broadband. There will be an emerging gap between broadband and narrowband users. Even by 2008, it's predicted that only 40% of households will have taken up broadband in Victoria. Digital and interactive television. Digital and interactive television may become a very significant internet protocol device. There will be a gap between pay TV and free-to-air TV users in regards to what they can do. What I call morphed mobile telephony. Many of us here today are parents, and like you, I find the mobile phone bills run up by children to be frightening. With the convergence of technologies, we can expect handsets to be a mobile phone, a personal assistant, a web browser and a wallet all in one. We could routinely see people use them to pay parking meters, which they do today, buy a drink, make a phone call, schedule a meeting, or call up train timetables, which will be the emerging medium for kids to get access to train timetables. Of course, there will be great commercial incentive and peer pressure on individuals, particularly the young, to get this technology. But with more expensive multifunction handsets, we may find a new gap between the haves and have-not. The effect of them will not be just in terms of limited information or social prestige, but in the convenience at which they conduct basic transactions in societies. And coming with that is the movement to timed telephone calls as well. We can also perceive the start of a subtle shift from fixed price calls to timed calls for information and entertainment services in Australia. Increasingly, as these calls are made by mobile devices, a larger percentage of our calls will be timed. If you take, for an example, Telstra, who's the dominant carrier, have about 10 billion local calls over their network a year at about 4 minutes a call. That's 40 billion minutes of calls per year over Telstra. Currently, they have 20 billion timed calls across their network, either mobile, international or fixed to mobile. There is no doubt that 40 billion phone calls that are untimed will start migrating to timed local calls. In conclusion, no doubt technology offers undoubted convenience to some and the challenge of exclusion for others. The uneven impact of technology poses questions of equity and participation. Hopefully this two-day conference is a significant opportunity to explore many aspects regarding current and emerging technology use in society. And it's with great pleasure that I officially open the conference today and finish by introducing the keynote speaker, Professor Stephen Coleman. Professor Coleman is currently the Cisco Visiting Professor of E-Democracy at the Oxford Internet Institute. He was the pioneer of online consultation for the Parliament of the United Kingdom. He has been the chair of the Independent Commission on Alternate Voting Methods and is the author of several recent works, including Bowling Together and Realising Democracy Online, a Civic Commons in Cyberspace. In his keynote address, Professor Coleman will try, or will argue, that we've moved beyond the early speculative, theoretical and experimental ideals and dilemmas of e-democracy. In calling for a new set of policy considerations for the next phase of development in this area, Professor Coleman will examine the implications for this for political institutions in our society. I wish you every success for a fruitful and productive conference over the next 2 days, and I take great pleasure in welcoming Professor Stephen Coleman.
Thank you very much. Colleagues and friends, I want to begin by raising questions and working my way cautiously, gradually, towards answers. Too often as academics and as policymakers, we rush at the answers, the solutions, the grand strategies, only to realise as we're doing so that the questions we should have been asking at the beginning are questions that we've omitted to address. So let me put at the beginning of this conference what I think are some important but basic questions. Do we really know, when we use terms like e-government, e-governance, e-democracy, do we really know what any of these terms actually mean? Is the ubiquitous E anything more than the 21st century's favourite quick fix prefix, a metaphor in desperate search of tangibility? Can democracy, this term that we throw around as if we all understand it and agree about it, can it as a term really be regarded as having a coherent and substantive meaning when it is so often appropriated by the self-serving rhetorics of corporate, imperial and other exclusive interests? And when we combine such pliable and hybrid buzzwords and get e-democracy, can we expect this to be a term that illuminates more than it hides? We should try to make some sense of these terms at the outset, because too often terms are used as if they are already agreed, uncontested, and beyond dispute. And it is precisely at that point of the use of terminology that we get things badly wrong. So democracy. Democracy is a project of the imagination around which we erect shaky edifices of constitutionality and political practice. The object of the democratic imagination is, and always has been, power and its exercise by and in the interest of the people who constitute society. The more that power is exercised by and for the people, the more democratic a society is. Now, insofar as technology describes not only hardware, machines, computers, but systems of skill, technique and knowledge, democracy can itself be regarded as a political technology, as a way of producing and distributing social power. And every so often, new technical phenomena appear. Print in the 15th century, telegraphy in the 19th century, broadcasting in the 20th century. And these lead us to reshape the way in which we produce, distribute, and represent social power. And then, we try to adapt these technologies to fit in with existing constitutional and political practices. But ultimately, such practices are themselves reshaped. Then there's the E, which is a metaphor for another metaphor, the Internet. What exactly is the Internet? Do we know what we're talking about when we refer to that? For some, it is that which lies within their computer, the innards, a virtual mind, a cyber soul, a highway, an agora, a mall, a library, a portal, a web, a brain, an ethereal universe of bits and bytes. We surf, we scroll, we browse, we search, we navigate, we post, we chat, we lurk, we log on, and then we log off. Recent history abounds with technological metaphors of change. The information age, e-governance, the weightless economy, the cyber revolution, the dot-com explosion, and then, of course, the dot-com crash. These are the illuminating but also the illusory metaphors of the digital age. And like all metaphors, they reflect discourses which are socially constructed and politically contestable. So I want to argue at the outset that e-democracy, if it is to mean anything at all, should be understood as a work in progress, perhaps a work in permanent progress, rather than a completed historical construct. What I want to do in this lecture today is explore and problematize the discourse of e-democracy, to illuminate its aspirational trajectory, question its rhetoric, and explore its policy relevance to a world of high risk and intense complexity. Specifically, I aim to achieve three things by the end of this lecture. First of all, to historicise e-democracy, to explore where it came from and the stages through which it has passed. Secondly, to show in terms of democratic theory how the potential of the E affords opportunities in relation to the contemporary problems of democracy. And thirdly, to consider how contemporary democracies will or will not respond to the opportunities and challenges of e-democracy. So let us start with historicising this term. E-democracy began life as a speculative futurology, science fiction with a utopian edge. And now it is becoming a subject of government policy at every level. What has happened to cause this transition from the future to the present tense? E-democracy originated in two long-standing political projects. The first is a desire to utilise communication media in ways that transcend the monological, transmissive, one-way conversation of the traditional mass media. As early as 1932, Bertolt Brecht famously argued that the radio would be the finest possible communication apparatus in public life, a vast network of pipes. That is to say, it would be if it knew how to receive as well as to transmit, how to let the listener speak as well as hear, how to bring him into a relationship instead of isolating him. On this principle, the radio should step out of the supply business and organise its listeners as suppliers. Now, with every development in communication technologies, new hopes of generating such interactive mediation have been revived. Leslie Johnson's excellent book on early radio in Australia shows very clearly this tension between radio as a mass medium of broadcast and radio as a connector of individuals who are producers as well as receivers. Cable television in California in the 1980s, as my colleague Bill Dutton has written about, was again the basis for such hopes. So the rise of personal computers linked to public networks, characterised by an inherent feedback path in the mid-1990s, was bound to stimulate a new generation of beliefs about the democratization of the media. A second originating drive for e-democracy. It's easy to forget that at the beginning of the 1990s, the world went through a collective delusion of democratic triumphalism, never more intoxicating than in the Anglo-American polities. The Cold War was over, democracy had won the day, the New World Order was the only show in town. In those famous words of Francis Fukuyama, history had come to an end. It was, of course, remarkably naive, as subsequent history has tragically demonstrated. But there has been too little historical analysis, I would suggest, of the correlation between this historical euphoria and the emergence of the internet into the world as a new medium. Much of the early rhetoric around e-democracy can be best understood as a response to the new global challenges of a democracy that was ascendant and needed to be connected. The claims made for the internet were far from understated. Recall United States Vice President Al Gore's famous vision, I quote, "I see a new Athenian age of democracy, forged in the fora that the government information infrastructure will create." Nothing less than a new Athenian age of democracy. Never to be far behind when it comes to overstatement, hyperbole and emptiness, the European Union argued, and I quote, "The new information technologies may for the first time in the history of industrial societies under liberal regimes make it possible to recreate the perfect information arena. The agora of ancient Greece," this is incidentally the European Union we're talking about, "a meeting place where citizens could go to be fully informed and participate directly with no intermediary in the government of the city, exercising all their political rights unconditionally and without restriction." Now, added to these two factors, the push to democratize interactive media and the euphoria around the New World Order, was the rapid takeoff of the digital ICT market in the mid-1990s. As the internet took off at a pace that seemed even faster than the take-up of domestic television sets in the early 1960s, I should say, the vendors and visionaries whipped themselves into a state of veritable hyperbole, attributing to the internet deterministic capacities to revolutionize everything, from how we shop to how we govern ourselves. The excessive claims of the early e-democrats should be understood, therefore, in terms of these three contexts. A genuine belief that the internet was a medium we had all been waiting for that could liberate us from the mass media and democratize public communication. A belief that globally ascendant democracy needed a globally ubiquitous communication space in which to constitute and manage the information infrastructure for a new world order. And in less noble terms, a belief that the internet would be endlessly profitable for IT suppliers and adaptable to the fantasies of dot-com visionaries. In this atmosphere, a range of hyperbolic scenarios emerged and were taken much more seriously than they ought to have been. For example, Lawrence Grossman's book, The Electronic Republic, presented a vision of computerized self-governance. Sorry, I need to go back. Yeah. In kitchens, living rooms, dens, bedrooms and workplaces throughout the nation, that's the American nation incidentally, citizens have begun to apply electronic devices to political purposes, giving those who use them a degree of empowerment they never had before. By pushing a button, typing online, talking to a computer, they will be able to tell their president, senators, members of Congress and local leaders what they want them to do and in what priority order. Very interesting book, written in the late 90s by the man who had been the chief political strategist for President Bill Clinton, Dick Morris, argued that, I quote, Jefferson's utopian vision of a democracy based on town meetings and direct popular participation is about to become a reality. Well, the hyperbolic period was short-lived, curtailed by the recalcitrant tendency of history to defeat optimistic expectations. The triumph of democracy soon turned into the new global conflict, symbolised by the 2 Iraq wars and by 9/11. The end of history was over. The dot-com bubble burst, and with it faded the excessive rhetoric that the internet would change everything. Now that could have been the end of e-democracy, returning its advocates to a marginalised position as utopian apostles of media democracy, but for the presence of a conspicuous and increasingly worrying trend facing governments in almost all countries: the disengagement of the public from the traditional institutions of democratic governance. One should not underestimate the extent and seriousness of this disengagement in liberal democracies throughout the world. It is manifested by both behavioural and attitudinal trends. In behavioural terms, people are voting less, that is to say, where they have a choice about voting. They are joining less. They are watching and reading political news less than ever before. There is simply a conspicuous movement away. To take my own country, the UK, we anticipate that in the June local and European parliamentary elections, 82% of the UK population will not bother to vote. In the last general election in 2001, 41% of eligible voters didn't vote, and 65% of 18 to 30-year-olds didn't vote. So the behavioural trends, not just in the UK but across the world, are serious. But the attitudinal trends are even more serious. And these manifest themselves in 2 ways. First of all, a collapse of public trust in political institutions, political processes, and political actors. A belief which has now become a default position that whatever politicians and governments do is bound to be dishonest, corrupt, and self-serving. And above all, attitudinally, a collapse in what political scientists call efficacy. That is to say, people's belief in how much they can influence or change the world. In the 1960s, we used to ask a regular survey question to people: agree or disagree with the following. Whatever I say, whatever I do, I can't influence the government. From the mid-60s to the mid-70s, something like 30% of the North American and European populations agreed with that statement. Over the last 10 years, consistently in opinion polls, between 70 and 80% of people agree with that statement. There has been a collapse in public efficacy. So what we've seen in the past 2 or 3 years is an increasing recognition on the part of major political players that there is some sort of potential relationship between the atrophying relationship between governments and governed and the internet as a new channel of public communication. Let's look at some of those responses. This comes from the former leader of the British Parliament, Robin Cook. There is a connection waiting to be made, he says, between the decline of democratic participation and the explosion in new ways of communicating. We need not accept the paradox that gives us more ways than ever to speak and leaves the public with a wider feeling than ever before that their voices are not being heard. Bert Weiss, IT Minister in the Danish government: I am convinced that the new digital road will lead to a democracy that is exciting to be part of. Erkki Liikanen, the EU Commissioner in charge of ICT: ICT can facilitate the exchange of ideas and increase participation in the decision-making process. Policy formulation requires better understanding of complex and charged issues, for which ICT offers a new means. Paul Martin, the new Prime Minister of Canada. Governments must use new technologies such as the Internet to empower citizens and provide them with greater ability to scrutinise and influence government decisions and actions. These are encouraging words, suggesting that e-democracy is making the transition from speculation to political reality. There are parliamentary inquiries into e-democracy in the UK Parliament, in the Bundestag in Germany, in the local state parliament here in Victoria. The United Kingdom government has a cabinet committee on e-democracy looking at key policy questions in this area. A range of experiments, particularly across European countries but across the whole world, are exploring ways of using aspects of digital technology to involve the public in areas of community building, policy making, and other forms of participation. But government activity in promoting e-democracy has tended to be less impressive because it has been characterised by three problems. First of all, the bureaucratic tendency to use these technologies to replicate obsolete practices. This is a perfectly normal and historically predictable Weberian bureaucratic response to something new. How do you use this new thing to do what we have always done before? So if you run bad services, how do you get those bad services to people faster? If you provide incomplete information, how do you get that incomplete information, particularly to young people? And so on. The second problem is the technocratic tendency to be obsessed by the technology itself, the gadgets, the buttons, how fast things are, how snazzy things are. And the third problem has been this obsession with e-voting, an obsession with doing the one thing that democracy has done reasonably well over the last 100 years and ignoring all of the others that we have lamentably failed to address. In short, there has been a tendency to institutionalize the technology, to usurp its transformative energy and constrain its creative risks. But as the new technologies and techniques become embedded, they give rise to new ways of organizing practice. Or to put it another way, they creatively disrupt routine processes by affording scope for new relationships. So I want to turn now to the scope of the Internet as a disruptive and reshaping force within relationships of democratic representation. Political representation is necessary when citizens are removed, physically, cognitively, or otherwise, from the locus of public decision-making, and their interests, preferences, and values have to be expressed via an aggregating medium. To put it another way, if everyone could be fully present and attentive within the political sphere at all times, representation would be unnecessary. Representing entails mediating between the absent and the present. This is an essentially communicative activity entailing the symbolic embodiment of a previously absent entity. Now, there are two ways in which we might think about democratic representation. Firstly, we are represented when our representatives speak as if we were speaking ourselves. The representative is a sort of ventriloquist dummy, an aggregate dummy for all the collective voices being represented. So as citizens, our task is to engage in democratic ventriloquy and to slap the dummy if it starts talking on its own. That's one model. Call it Model 1. Second model, we are represented when our representatives speak for us, on our behalf. They are the trustees of our collective interests. This is the notion of the representative as the ventriloquist. We do not elect them to do what we might do ourselves. We elect them because we don't have the time or maybe the competence to make a constant series of policy decisions for ourselves. So in the second sense, representatives are special, extraordinary people whose task is to deliberate and to decide on our behalf. Now, Model 1 appeals to our democratic instincts. Ideally, democracy means self-government. If we don't have the time to govern ourselves in every respect, we at least want to ensure that the people we elect to govern us are, first of all, somewhat like us, and secondly, in some ways, a reflection of what we think. But the downside of Model 1 is the problem of populism. Do we really want our representatives to reflect our views when our views are often ill-informed, inconsistent with one another, and illiberal insofar as majorities might be dismissive of minorities? In general, we fear these consequences. So Model 1 appeals to us more than Model 2 as an ideal, but in practice most people prefer Model 2. The problem with Model 2 is that it seems and it feels undemocratic. It seems like a very thin notion of democratic self-governance. Famously, it was described by one of its leading advocates, Joseph Schumpeter, in the following way. Democracy does not mean and cannot mean that the people actually rule, in any obvious sense of the terms people, and rule. Democracy means only that the people have the opportunity of accepting or refusing the men who are to rule them. The rationale for this thin and indirect notion of democratic representation was outlined by Walter Lippmann, whose work on public opinion in the 1920s and 30s has been a defining influence upon contemporary liberal democratic theory. Lippmann argued, I quote, "The mass of absolutely illiterate, feeble-minded, grossly neurotic, undernourished and frustrated individuals," that's you incidentally, "is very considerable. Thus, a wide popular appeal is circulated amongst persons who are mentally children or barbarians, people whose lives are a morass of entanglements, people whose vitality is exhausted, shut-in people, and people whose experience has comprehended no factor in the problem under discussion. The stream of public opinion is stopped by them in little edges of misunderstanding, where it is discoloured with prejudice and far-fetched analogy." Well, if Lippmann and Schumpeter are right in their analyses, the best kind of democratic representation is that which keeps the public at arm's length, or further, from the practical work of policy formation or decision-making. The problem with this theory, apart from its somewhat offensive scent of aristocratic condescension, is that it sums up precisely the reasons that the public give time and time again for not liking political institutions or elected representatives. They feel that such institutions are removed from them, look down upon them, don't respect them, don't listen to them. And there is abundant qualitative evidence to show that this is how the public think about contemporary liberal democracy. Now, as we've seen, politicians are becoming rightly sensitive to this. They're spending a lot of time talking about what they call disconnection and the need to reconnect. And I want to now try to demonstrate what this notion of disconnection and reconnection actually means. I think that the four things down that side of the graph here or the diagram here, are what we don't want from representatives. We don't want them to be distant, either physically, geographically, or for that matter culturally. We want them to be close. We don't want them to be detached in the sense that they are there and we are here, politically. We want them to operate on a basis of mutuality. That is to say, they can only succeed in doing what they do if they do it with us. We don't want them to be exclusive in the sense that they have all the knowledge, they have all the answers, they are the experts. We want them to be coherent in the sense that they produce out of all of our collective aggregate voices a sensitivity to the diversity and the nuances of public opinion and concern. And we don't want them to be aloof in a moral or psychological sense. We want them to show empathy. We don't necessarily want them to be us, but we want them to know us and to have a sense of where we come from. Now, the key question for e-democracy, as far as I am concerned, is whether the E, specifically digital ICT, possess characteristics that might change the relationships of representation. When I say this, I'm not presenting a technologically determinist account whereby technology automatically produces this or that effect. I prefer to see such possible effects in terms of what Jay Blumler and I have called vulnerable potential, to be determined by policy choices which are themselves democratically determined. So I now want to go on to look at the scope for democratic reconnection using ICT. We want closeness between representatives and the represented. And I want to suggest there are 4 characteristics of digital ICT which help to bring about these 4 desirable characteristics of democratic representation. So we want closeness, and the first characteristic is co-presence. The capacity to shrink space so that the represented and the representative have a capacity to be in the same virtual space as one another. Not occasionally or even some of the time, but all of the time. Where there is an accessibility and availability about the representative, which is inescapable. Now, the consequence of mediated co-precedence is to undermine conventional justifications for thin or minimal communication between representatives and represented. It is to open up communicative equality. In the UK, the Hansard Society has run some experimental online surgeries designed to explore these peculiarly private consultations between representatives and our constituents, and to see what happens when these take place in virtual spaces, where the Member of Parliament can be in London and the constituent in Liverpool several hundred miles away. What happens through virtual co-presence are 3 things. First of all, citizens report feeling less intimidated by the encounter between themselves and political representatives. They don't have to physically walk into an office. They don't have to go into somebody else's place or space. They don't have to adapt. They can speak and feel from where they are. Secondly, they have an archived account of what took place during that communication. How many of us have been to the doctor, or for that matter, been to see a senior political figure and come out of the meeting not remembering a word that took place? So here people have a sense of what it was that is stored from that conversation. And thirdly, people felt a greater sense of trust in the relationship because they were able to have greater control over it. Second characteristic, mutuality. Manuel Castells has talked and written eloquently about the rise of network society. Policy networks have been the most important single influence upon the way that governments do their business over the last 10 to 15 years. Smart governments are governments who share, who learn, who internationalize knowledge in ways that are sophisticated and cooperative. What we are seeing in politics now is the growth of grassroots policy networks. Policy networks of people who would normally have been either under-resourced or too dispersed to communicate together about their collective interests. but who now can bring those energies into government in ways that can start to have efficacious influence. We want coherence from representation. We want representation to hear many voices. And the way to hear many voices is to listen to many voices, is to have the kind of polylogue where many people can involve themselves in a single conversation about a policy area. In the UK Parliament, I have been involved in running now 12 online consultations with MPs and committees, in which members of the public have spent a month online interacting with the MPs and interacting with each other to decide what kind of policies are most needed in areas where they have a very specific stake, ranging from chronically disabled people intervening in a committee looking at stem cell research, where most of the messages coming into the committee came from people with Parkinson's disease and multiple sclerosis, mainly posted in the middle of the night, incidentally, because people couldn't sleep. And a very famous parliamentary online consultation on domestic violence, in which almost 1,000 pieces of evidence were put by women from up and down the country to a committee looking at domestic violence policy. Over half of those women had not been online before the consultation started. So what one is seeing is an opening up of the policy agenda. And finally, in relation to empathy, what we are seeing is the growth of what I would call a medium of self-disclosure, a medium where one can come online and tell the world what it is like to be oneself, to produce a blog, to produce a segment of one's own reality for everybody else to know about. Whether you are an Iraqi civilian when the bombs are about to fall, or whether you are a journalist who wants to write a story but isn't allowed to do so. I think what we are seeing here are a set of characteristics that open up some theorized potential for democracy in the digital age. What kind of democracy is all of this leading us towards? I want to conclude by offering 3 different answers to this question, and briefly. The first answer is that political institutions remain pretty much as they are. They resist the reshaping pressures of digital ICT. Politicians continue to complain that too much contact with the people they represent constitutes an intractable problem and is making it impossible for them to do their jobs. And it's remarkable across the world the number of politicians who, rather like shopkeepers in the days of rationing, complain that these awful people keep wanting to talk to them as well as vote for them. Citizens continue to feel estranged and unheard. Where they have the choice, fewer and fewer people will bother to vote. Political parties will become eccentric clubs for the elderly and the obsessed. Parliaments will become less relevant than ever as they stand out as non-interactive bodies in a world where interactivity is ubiquitous in the spheres of learning, entertainment, health, and everyday sociability. Need any of this actually matter? Can't the political elite simply carry on governing without being able to claim the legitimacy of this kind of connection with the public? Yes, they can. In the short term, this is a perfectly feasible model for an extremely thin, indirect, Schumpeterian model of representative governance. But I doubt whether such a model would be sustainable in the long term for this reason. In an age of increasing and intensifying risk, and that is the characteristic of the 21st century, we are in a high-risk society where the whole political atmosphere has changed. It is no longer simply the job of government to maintain stability, but to react to unpredictable changes. And in such circumstances, the absence of connection to the public makes it extremely difficult, often impossible, for governments to introduce new and disruptive policies. This applies particularly to governments of the progressive left, who traditionally rely upon establishing collaborative partnerships with the public in order to implement structurally radical policies. Governments who want to make changes have a particular need to develop new ways of engaging the public. Now, my strong sense is that without exploiting the opportunities of interactive ICT, governments everywhere will become more top-down, more risk-aversive, and more remote. In short, less democratic. The second scenario is that the techniques of e-democracy are adopted, but they are at the same time adapted to conform to the traditional rules and practices of indirect political representation. So, although governments, parliaments and parties have lots of websites and email databases and e-strategies, these are all utilised in ways that enable the old political game to be played in the same old way. So political communication remains top-down, it remains a broadcast transmission process. And one sees this, for example, in MPs' websites on the whole, and political parties' e-campaigns on the whole. These amount to little more than poor attempts to replicate television on the web. A number of scholars, particularly in the United States, have argued that if there is a tendency, that there is a tendency towards the normalization of new media. And several of them have set out convincing empirical accounts of this happening. I want to enter two qualifications to these accounts. First of all, the United States is not typical of the rest of the world. It is an atypical democracy. Its political parties are different. Its level of social capital is different. Secondly, there is very little evidence to show that using ICT to conduct traditional top-down politics is a particularly successful or effective way of putting across your message. In fact, it's a rather risky way. My advice to politicians who want to use digital ICT as if they were broadcast media is don't waste your time. If you want to talk at people, the internet is the wrong place to do it, because the ethos of the internet is that you don't send out messages unless you expect to get them back. My third and final scenario is that instead of e-democracy becoming politically normalized, political normality becomes democratized. I have in mind here Tony Giddens' clarion call for what he calls the democratization of democracy. This is a radical and historically suggestive proposition to which I subscribe. We live in a democratic culture that is not on the whole based upon an ethos of respect for the public. On the contrary, for most of the history of democracy, we have expected the public to be deferential and passive. We have constructed democratic institutions that are over-centralized, unresponsive, and hard to get into. We have come to talk about democratic politics as if it is a game for cynics and apparatchiks. What might contemporary democracy become if it were democratized? How could e-democracy contribute to this process? My final points. Let's return to those two models of representation that have constituted such a problematic ambiguity in democratic theory, and let us give some thought to disambiguating them. First, you recall there is direct plebiscitary democracy, and then there is indirect representative democracy. We reject the first because of the danger of ill-informed populism, but the second seems not to work because it leaves the demos feeling disconnected. Now, instead of regarding direct democracy and indirect representation as mutually exclusive political models, I am arguing that we should seek a synthesis by combining the most appealing and trustworthy elements of both. What do people want from direct democracy? They want to be involved, heard, respected, and able to have a direct influence on specific policies that concern them. These are perfectly reasonable and sensible democratic aspirations. But citizens do not want to spend all day formulating and considering policies or passing laws. They want elected representatives to do that, but not to be remote from them. As digital ICT open up the possibility of developing relationships in which governance can be more collaborative and conversational, the possibility of direct representation, the synthesis, emerges. Direct representation would not bind representatives to the precise will of the people, but would connect them to a knowledge and understanding of public will in ways that would be far more sophisticated than reliance upon opinion polling or media mood setting. A political culture of direct representation would give us three things. First of all, new institutional forms of self-representation for the public. And we're seeing these emerging everywhere now. Networks of public connection to one another, where the public's first instinct in a moment of crisis or need is not to go to government, but to go to their own networks. Secondly, the emergence of what I would call two-way accountability. Not the old top-down accountability, where the politicians give the account and the public don't believe them, but a form of account giving and account receiving, where giving accounts becomes part of the public's role. And thirdly, new and better ways of making policy and making legislation, where public experience is considered not after the event, but before and during the process. Where e-democracy has been embraced authentically and with commitment, we're already able to discern the beginnings of these emerging trends. But these are early days, and there is a need for the most judicious empirical analysis before we can draw any kind of decisive conclusions. And as we draw those conclusions, there will be different conclusions in different countries and within different countries. As I said at the outset, let's start with the basic questions and move from theory to an understanding of what is possible, desirable, perhaps even urgently necessary in practice. That, I would argue, presents us with an important research agenda for e-democracy. Thank you very much.
Yes. In a recursive ethos, Stephen's quite happy to take a few questions. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes, so if there's some people... Yes? Yes.
I've got to talk to you, especially because you raised those issues of trust and risk. As is always there. So I'm interested in the issue of modelling and the dangers of modelling. Because I see everyone here taking notes, they're looking for answers. And what I want to propose or ask you about is that because we're dealing with such an emergent form of technology where it's changing day by day, there's a danger in trying to model what should be or what is, when in fact I believe we need to take some time out over a year or two to see what's happening. What's happening, because as you said, there's new forms of dialogue happening. We are networking in new ways. Politicians aren't linking in there, and yet the danger is public service or training try to develop a linkage model which bears no relation whatsoever to these new forms of dialogue that are happening. So I haven't explained myself well, but I suppose it's about that whole issue of emergent forms of what we deal with over the next, say, 5 years rather than 1 year. It may in fact be that we need more time rather than less time.
I agree with that. I think we have to be very careful about blueprints, and particularly global blueprints. I come from a country that's spent 1,000 years thinking about whether to have a constitution, so I accept the the notion that one has to take these things slowly. I think 2 points. I think, first of all, the importance of democratic theory. I think the importance of recognising what is contestable is cannot be understated. It's incredibly important in this that one asks very basic questions. Do we want more democracy? Do we want this kind of representation or that kind of representation? Do we want these people or those people to have voices? And I think it's those basic questions that can only be answered democratically. I mean, we can't expect either officials or elected representatives to come up with neat answers to that. We have to think them through. We have to consider the risks of the consequences of different kinds of answers. And we have to recognise that we will trial different ways of doing this in different places. So I take your point. I mean, I think we have to be very cautious about this. I mean, I think I have been, because I have spent a few years thinking about this, and I continue to think about it, and I continue to question what works and what doesn't. Oh.
A number of points, and I think I'd like to hear your response. The first one is, what you're broadcasting is the death of the Berkeley representative. The second component is that the internet provides access to information, so that evidence-based policy now has a completely changed set of rules. So I think that complementarity for the representation is there. And thirdly, the nature of the coalitions with which governments have to deal, because they must be accurate and checked. For example, 75% of those likely in New South Wales or on the internet that are all their own clusters. We have a much more fluid basis of those key or semi-key bodies which government is enforced against it.
Yeah, very interesting points. I mean, the death of the Burkean representative. Look, the death of the traditional model of representation is not something that the internet has brought about. It's something that powerful executive governments have brought about. We have parliaments all over the world full of people who don't know what they're there for. If they're in the governing party, they know what they're there for. They're there to do what they're told by the whips. And if they're in the opposition, they might as well not bother to turn up. So we have this real problem of identity for elected representatives who have to work out what it means to represent in a society where we actually have what Quinton Hogg, Lord Hailsham, called elective dictatorships. I think the Burkean representative always was a caricature, incidentally. Burke went on to say something in his speech to his electors at the end in 1776 that is not usually quoted, which is that what representatives should have with the people they represent is the closest possible communication. And actually, in the late 18th century, representatives did, because you were able to talk to the people you represented face to face around a series of dinner tables in the course of a year. What has happened is that the problem of scale has hit mass democratic politics and required new techniques of that kind of conversational interaction. I think your point about aggregation is absolutely right. I mean, I think we need to think about aggregatory politics in different ways. I think most citizens in most countries don't know that political scientists and political theorists in most universities around the world have made up their mind that actually rational choice theory makes any vote cast by any person in any election pretty well a waste of time in terms of any priority of objective ends resulting from that vote. Now, if we stick to that notion of democracy, where what we are essentially doing is, in this Schumpeterian way, putting our faith in groups of people who most of us don't trust and most of us only want to support in order to get another group out, that is going to be a pretty wretched basis for the kind of democracy we need if we are going to confront some of the very risky challenges of years ahead. Yeah.
My question is about generational change.
Yeah.
And we're going to see elections in the next couple of years, and the UK-Australia comparison's got a play in some people's minds
Yeah.
in terms of what might happen.
Yeah.
Could you speak to perhaps time horizons as the younger generations are coming forward out of this disengaged model into the times when they will be expected to take on those reins, and where the break point might be in the next 10, 15 years on that matter?
I think it's an extremely interesting question, this generational question. I mean, let me give you an example. In 1996, the BBC set up what is the biggest, by far the biggest web service in the world, and BBC Online. It set it up on a shoestring. You know, it is now the third service of the BBC, but it costs less than the world service costs to run. BBC Online now has just under 20 million people going to its site every month. It has something like 1 million messages on its message boards every month. It has something coming up to 25 million pages of web text online. And it is primarily used by 18 to 30-year-olds who regard it as the basic source of news in the world today. And not just in the UK, but in other countries too. For example, after 9/11, one of the key places a lot of Americans went for their news was to the BBC website. So what one is actually seeing is a medium that is appealing to young people, that is providing an enormous amount of news, discussion, reflective, philosophical material, and is incredibly successful and expansive. And yet, if you talk to politicians, what they will say to you is, this is a lost generation, we can't get at them. So clearly the medium is doing something right, and the old institutions are doing something wrong. And I think what you have got to do is you've got to work, and you've got to put resources into this, specifically at that demographic group, for one very important reason. That the crisis of trust and efficacy at the moment is a cohort crisis. In other words, it is a crisis that people are carrying with them from one generation to the next. When I was studying political science in the past, we believed two things which we no longer believe. We believed that more educated people were more likely to participate in politics, and we believed that as younger people get older, they leave off their old non-participating tendencies and they start to participate. The evidence from the UK, the evidence from Germany, the evidence from France is now very clearly showing, first of all, that there is not a significant difference between educated and less educated people in terms of their attitude to political participation. And secondly, that age disengagement is a cohort effect. In other words, if you were disaffected when you were in your 20s, you continue in your 30s, you continue in your 40s. And something has to actually stop that. And actually the most disengaged people in terms of not trusting politics in most countries are middle-aged people. Young people are, in a sense, too young to have learnt not to trust. And older people tend to have civic habits which make them trust more at the moment. It's people in their 40s and 50s who are the most disengaged. So the question, certainly not the most disengaged necessarily, but the most untrusting. What do you do about that? You have to have very specific and well-resourced campaigns to address those groups, and not to address them from afar, but to address them from within. One of the things I often get asked by politicians in the UK is, how do we talk to the environmentalists? How do we talk to the anti-globalization movement? How do we talk to the animal rights people? How do we get to them? What sort of website do we need to set up so that they will come to us? And I say, what you've got to do is go to them. You go to their website and you talk to them. That's risky, because you're not on your own ground, you're not in control. Many of them will not have heard of you because you're a politician, and you're only actually known within certain circles. So you've got to go out there and you've got to argue that you have a legitimacy to present a particular point of view and to pursue a particular kind of argument. They find that very threatening. More and more of them will do it. They will do it with the internet just as they learned to do it with television. I remember Clement Attlee in 1950, at the beginning of the 1950s, I don't remember it personally, but I remember Clement Attlee, I remember Clement Attlee coming back into London Airport on an aeroplane. He was greeted by the BBC journalists who said, "Mr. Attlee, you called an election, is there anything you would like to say to the British public through the BBC?" And he looked at them and he said, "No." That will never ever happen again. Politicians now will parachute out of the aeroplane from a distance in order to get to the cameras. And they will be doing the same with the internet. They have to actually recognise that this is not an alternative, another form of broadcasting, and that young people aren't going to go to them. The worst thing that parliaments do all over the world is to set up these awful young people sections on parliamentary websites, where they have sort of little, you know, colourful logos of the parliamentary, rules and so on. Nobody goes to them. Nobody would, if you think of that. If you had a child who went to that, you'd send it to see a counsellor.
I've got last two questions. There's one there, and there was just one in the middle there somewhere, I think. Yep. Just.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I think in Australia, politicians would be crazy to change that. I mean, if you've got compulsory voting and you can fine people and ultimately send them to prison for not voting for you, then clearly that is a very satisfactory arrangement for a political system. And you know, when I was a young man, I could have had the same system where, you know, it was compulsory for attractive women to go out with me. That would have also been a very nice idea. But, you know, the problem is you can't impose relationships on people. You can impose resentment on them. You can make them feel, you know, that they are going to get the other lot out, or they're going to attack you. But the world it's not like that. And we had that debate after the 2001 election. I mean, look at what's happened in the UK. We traditionally had about 75% of our voters casting a vote by choice in every election, 50s, 60s and 70s. In the 1997 election, the one that Tony Blair and the Labour Party won, 71.3% of the UK population voted. That was the lowest level since 1935. In the 2001 election, that fell to 59%. And we think it's going down. This is a trend right the way across the world, and it would be a trend in Australia if you gave people the choice, and that's why I say the political elite are right not to give them the choice, because, you know, if you're used to it and you have a popular, I mean, people in Britain wouldn't put up with it. You know, after the 2001 election, some politicians discussed the idea of making voting compulsory. Now, I just don't think the British people would buy it. I think they would say the reason we're not voting is not because we think that it is so important that we want it to be made compulsory. The reason we're not voting is we want to give you a message. One of the worst things that British politicians, and I've talked to them about this, can say, and they have said this stupidly, they've gone on television and said to people, if you don't vote for us, governments will not have legitimacy. And because what the people say is, yeah, that's the idea. you're beginning to get the message. I mean, you know, one can't appeal to people. One of the things that has been conspicuously declining in all democracies is a sense of civic duty around democracy. Yeah, there are all kinds of problems about a decline in a sense of civic duty. And we experience those every day, and they are real problems. But one ought not to be too moralistic about politics, and one should never, in fact, I think, bring this kind of morality into politics. And the reality is, one doesn't have a civic duty to vote. One simply doesn't. One doesn't have a civic duty to vote in a rigged Iranian election. One doesn't have a civic duty to vote if no politician is going to bother to go out and get your vote. One doesn't have a civic duty to vote if one is regarded as an inferior member of society by everybody and no government looks like it's taking notice of you. There are a whole range of people who simply cannot be told they have the civic duty to vote. And the more you tell them that, the more they will actually see it as being something that is an ideological position. So what you have to do is convince people. You have to do exactly what people have to do in commerce, what they have to do in entertainment, what they have to do in any area of public persuasion. You have to demonstrate to people that it's worth doing. I was at a meeting of a group of politicians who brought in an advertising company. And they said to this advertising company, how would you make us popular? And what do you do in order to deal with products that have become unpopular? And they said, we'll tell you what we would do. We would tell people the truth. We would tell people that you are really unpopular and want to become popular. And the politicians sat there and said, we tell them the truth. We tell them that we're unpopular. And the advertising agents left and the politicians left, and there was an absolute dialogue of the death. I think that is the way politicians have to go. Politicians are in difficulties, in the way that the church is currently in difficulties, in the way that they have to look to institutions that have had problems in the past. They have to look at what those institutions have done. They have to look at how you reconnect. They have got a means of doing this. Digital technology is one of the key contributors to that way of doing it. But it would be absolutely monstrous to assume that they can force this on people. They can't.
One last really quick question.
Yep.
Okay.
You mean quick answer? Yeah. 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 Not enough. I mean, I think the two institutions that need to really engage with this are the European Union, because it's a international bloc that is in search of a demos, and the United Nations. I think the United Nations has a particularly important role to play. And we are, next month in Athens, going to launch an organisation. It's already launched, but we're going to publicly launch an organisation which is called Access to Democracy, which has on its steering committee Kofi Annan and Nelson Mandela, and a number of international activists as well as thinkers in this particular area, which is working particularly on this question of globalization. Because I think global accountability is what counts. I mean, as a global citizen, my main concern in the world at the moment is who's going to win the American election at the end of this year. I don't have a vote in that election. However good Howard Dean's campaign was, and however many people met up or didn't meet up, I'm not there, and I'm disenfranchised. And I think, there are many people who think that way. One of the things that Access to Democracy is going to do, and I'm involved in it, Nick Negroponte is involved in it, a number of other people from other countries are involved in it, is we are setting up a debate involving internet radio in Africa amongst citizens across Africa on what they think the key issues facing Africa are. Because what we think and what we are told by the UN is that African people have very different assumptions about the problems facing them from the problems that donors from the West have. And we want to encourage those to be articulated and discussed. There has been a recent online consultation going on in Cyprus, between North and South Cyprus, which I think has been a really interesting one. And I should say George Papandreou, former foreign minister in Greece, has played a key role in Access to Democracy to try to promote these kind of global developments. So yeah, I mean, I think it needs to happen. And I think the other thing that needs to happen is we need to engage with the people who are already doing global things online. And the anti-globalization movement has been a tremendous success story. Now, the anti-globalization movement has enormous difficulty getting media coverage. Much of what it has to say is banal and frankly inconsistent. Much of what it has to say resonates with the majority of the population of the world. And its capacity to share that knowledge and make that knowledge more sophisticated and constructive is something that we should be looking to. And I think that particularly a number of politicians in Europe are looking at the moment at how one can foster some of the energy of the anti-globalization movement in a political arena that is going to be influential. So you raise a really important point. This is the fundamental problem of globalization. It's not that we don't have online mechanisms for democracy globally. We don't have offline mechanisms. We don't elect the members of the Security Council. I grew up believing that bribing people to vote in an election was a crime. We've just had a war where every time I switched on the news, I was told that either the Americans were going to bribe the members of the Security Council, or the Europeans were going to bribe the members of the Security Council, and whoever bribed the most was going to win the vote. Now, this seems to me something that is absolutely alien. We just had a debate in my country about who the new chairman and director general of the BBC is going to be. I don't have a vote in that. The people around the world who use the BBC don't have a vote in that. It seems to me that bringing these kind of global institutions into the democratic sphere is exactly the kind of thing that everything I've been saying today is about. And that's why I return to my original point. We need to be clear what we mean by democracy. Because if we take the existing mechanisms and we simply ask ourselves, can Howard Dean become president by using the internet, we will have an incredibly limited and impoverished notion of what democracy is all about. And what we need to ask is, what is the function of that president? What is the function of that election? What is the function of the people who vote in that election? What is their function after the election? Who asks them anything about democracy on a day-to-day basis? And as we ask those questions and develop those answers, we will democratise democracy.
On that note, I'd like to thank Stephen for a very stimulating and wide-ranging morning tea. Morning tea is now served back up in the foyer of the conference. Thank you, Stephen.